Okay, so this is part 8 of Good Omens. Sable had black hair, a trim black beard, and he had just decided to go corporate. He did drinks with his accountant. "How are we doing, Franny?" he asked her. 12 million copies sold so far. Can you believe that? They were doing drinks at a restaurant called Top of the Sixes on the top of 666 Fifth Avenue, New York. This was something that amused Sable ever so slightly. From the restaurant windows, you could see the whole of New York. At night, the rest of New York could see the huge red 666s that adorned all 4 sides of the building. Of course, it was just another street number. If you started counting, you'd be bound to get to it eventually. But you had to smile. Sable and his accountant had just come from a small, expensive, and particularly exclusive restaurant in Greenwich Village, where the cuisine was entirely nouvelle. A string bean, a pea, and a sliver of chicken breast aesthetically arranged on a square of china plate. Sable had invented it the last time he'd been in Paris. His accountant had polished her meat and 2 veg off in under 50 seconds and had spent the rest of the meal staring at the plate, the cutlery, and from time to time her fellow diners in a manner that suggested that she was wondering what they'd taste like, which was in fact the case. It had amused Sable enormously. He toyed with his Perrier. 12 million, hum? That's good. That's great. So, we're going corporate. It's time to blow the big one, am I right? California, I think. I want factories, restaurants, the whole schmear. We'll keep the publishing arm, but it's time to diversify. Yeah? Franny nodded. Sounds good, Sable. We'll need... She was interrupted by a skeleton. A skeleton in a Dior dress with tan skin stretched almost to snapping point over the delicate bones of the skull. The skeleton had long blonde hair and perfectly made-up lips. She looked like the person mothers around the world would point to muttering, "That's what'll happen to you if you don't eat your greens." She looked like a famine relief poster with style. She was New York's top fashion model, and she was holding a book. She said, excuse me, Mr. Sable, I hope you don't mind me intruding, but your book, it changed my life. I was wondering, would you mind signing it for me?" She stared imploringly at him with eyes deep sunk in gloriously eyeshadowed sockets. Sable nodded graciously and took the book from her. It was not surprising that she had recognized him, for his dark gray eyes stared out from his photo on the foil-embossed cover. Foodless dieting. Slim yourself beautiful. The book was called The Diet's Book of the Century. How do you spell your name? He asked. Cheryl. 2 R's, 1 Y, 1 L. You remind me of an old friend, he told her as he wrote swiftly and carefully on the title page. There you go. Glad you like it. Always good to meet a fan. What he'd written was this. Cheryl, a measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine. Rev 6:6, Dr. Raven Sable. It's from the Bible, he told her. She closed the book reverently and backed away from the table, thanking Sable. He didn't know how much this meant to her. He had changed her life. Truly he had. He had never actually earned the medical degree, he claimed, since there hadn't been any universities in those days, but Sable could see she was starving to death. He gave her a couple of months at the outside. Foodless. Handle your weight problem. Terminally. Franny was stabbing at her laptop computer hungrily, planning the next phrase in Sable's transformation of the eating habits of the Western world. Sable had bought her the machine as a personal present. It was very, very expensive, very powerful, and ultra slim. He liked slim things. There's a European outfit we can buy into for the initial toehold. Holdings Incorporated. They'll give us the Leicester tax base. Now, if we chance funds out through the Caymans into Luxembourg, and from there to Switzerland, we could pay for the factories in. But Sable was no longer listening. He was remembering the exclusive little restaurant. It had occurred to him that he had never seen so many rich people so hungry. Sable grinned, the honest open grin that grows with job satisfaction, perfect and pure. He was just killing time until the main event, but he was killing it in such exquisite ways. Time, and sometimes people. Sometimes he was called White, or Blanc, or Albus, or Chalky, or Weiss, or Snowy, or any one of 100 other names. His skin was pale, his hair a faded blonde, his eyes light gray. He was somewhere in his 20s at a casual glance, and a casual glance was all anyone ever gave him. He was almost entirely unmemorable. Unlike his two colleagues, he could never settle down in any one job for very long. He had had all manner of interesting jobs in lots of interesting places. He had worked at the Carnoble Power Station and at Windscale and at 3 Mile Island, always in minor jobs that weren't very important. He had been a minor but valued member of a number of scientific research establishments. He had helped to design the petrol engine and plastics and the ring pole can. He could turn his hand to anything. Nobody really noticed him. He was unobtrusive, his presence was cumulative. If you thought about it carefully, you could figure out that he had to have been doing something, yet had to have been somewhere. Had to have been somewhere. Oh my lord, sorry. Maybe he even spoke to you, but he was easy to forget, was Mr. White. At this time he was working as deckhand on an oil tanker heading towards Tokyo. The captain was drunk in his cabin. The first mate was in the head. The second mate was in the galley. That was pretty much it for the crew. The ship was almost completely automated. There wasn't much a person could do. However, if a person just happened to press the emergency cargo release switch on the bridge, the automatic systems would take care of releasing huge quantities of black sludge into the sea, millions of tons of crude oil with devastating effect on the birds, fish, vegetation, animals, and humans of the region. Of course, there were dozens of fail-safe interlocks and foolproof safety backups, but what the hell, there always were. Afterwards, there was a huge amount of argument as to exactly whose fault it was. In the end, it was left unresolved. The blame was appointed equally. Neither the captain, the first mate, nor the second mate ever worked again. For some reason, nobody gave much of a thought to Seaman White, who was already halfway to Indonesia on a tramp steamer piled high with rusting metal barrels to a particularly toxic weed killer. And there was another. He was in the square in Kumbulaland, and he was in the restaurants, and he was in the fish, and in the air, and in the barrels of weed killer. He was on the roads, and in houses, and in places, and in hovels. There was nowhere that he was a stranger, and there was no getting away from him. He was doing what he did best, and what he was doing was what he was. He was not waiting, he was working. Harriet Dowling returned home with her baby, which, on the advice of Sister Faith Prolix, who was more persuasive than Sister Mary, and with the telephonic agreement of her husband, she had named Warlock. The cultural attaché returned home a week later and pronounced the baby the spit of his side of the family. He also had his secretary advise in the lady for a nanny. Crowley had seen Mary Poppins on television one Christmas. Indeed, behind the scenes, Crowley had a hand in most television, although it was on the invention of the game show that he truly prided himself. He toyed with the idea of a hurricane as an effective and incredibly stylish way of disposing of the queue of nannies that would certainly form, or possibly stack up in a holding pattern, outside the cultural attaché's Regent's Park residence. He contented himself with a wide-cat tube strike, and when the day came, only one nanny turned up. She wore a knit tweed suit and discreet pearl earrings. Something about her might have said "nanny," but it said it in an undertone of the sort employed by British butlers in a certain type of American film. It also coughed discreetly and muttered that she could well be the sort of nanny who advises unspecified but strangely explicit services in certain magazines. Her flat shoes crunched up the gravel drive, and a gray dog padded silently at her side, white flecks of saliva dripping from its jaw. Its eyes glinted scarlet, and it glanced from side to side hungrily. She reached the heavy wooden door, smiled to herself, a brief, satisfied flicker, and rang the bell. It donged gloomily. The door was opened by a butler, as they say, of the old school. A night school just off the Tottenham Court Road, run by an elderly actor who had played butlers and gentlemen's gentlemen in films and television and on the stage since the 1920s. "I am Nanny Ostreth," she told him, and this, she continued, with the gray dog at her side, eyed the butler carefully, working out, perhaps, where it could bury the bones, is Rove. She left the dog in the garden and passed her interview with flying colors, and Mrs. Dowling led the nanny to see her new charge. She smiled unpleasantly. "What a delightful child," she said. "He'll be wanting a little tricycle soon." But one of those coincidences, another new member of staff arrived the same afternoon. He was the gardener, and as it turned out, he was amazingly good at his job. No one quite worked out why this should be the case, since he never seemed to pick up a shovel and made no effort to rid the garden of the sudden flocks of birds that filled it, and settled all over him at every opportunity. He just sat in the shade while around him the residence gardens bloomed and bloomed. Warlock used to come down to see him when he was old enough to toddle, and Nanny was doing whatever it was she did on her afternoons off. This here's Brother Slug," Gardener would tell him, "and this tiny critter is Sister Potato Weevil. Remember, Warlock, as you walk your way through the highways and byways of life's rich and fulsome path, to have love and reverence for all living things." Nanny says that weaving things is fit. Oh my lord, sorry. It's baby talk and it's hard to read. Nanny says that living things is fit to be ground under my heels, Mr. Francis, said little Warlock, stroking Brother Slug and then wiping his hand consciously over his Kermit the Frog overall. "You don't listen to that woman," Francis would say. "You listen to me." At night, Nanny Arsareth sang nursery rhymes to Warlock. "Oh, the grand old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill and crushed all the nations of the world and brought them under the rule of Satan our master." And this little piggy went to Hades, this little piggy stayed home, this little piggy ate raw and steaming human flesh, this little piggy violated virgins, and this little piggy clambered over a heap of dead bodies to get to the top. Brother Francis says, the gardener says that I must selflessly practice virtue and love to all living things, said Warlock. "You don't listen to that man, darling," the nanny would whisper as she tucked him into his little bed. "You listen to me." And so it went. The arrangement worked perfectly. A no-score win. Nanny Osirith brought the child a little tricycle, but could never persuade him to ride it inside the house. And he was scared of Rover. In the background, Crawley and Aziraphale met on the tops of buses and in art galleries and at concerts, compared notes, and smiled. When Warlock was 6, his nanny left, taking Rover with her. The gardener handed in his resignation on the same day. Neither of them left with quite the same spring in their step with which they had arrived. Warlock now found himself being educated by 2 tutors. Mr. Harrington taught him about Atalia the Hun, Vlad Drukol, and the darkness intrinsic in the human spirit. He had avoided mentioning that Atalia was nice to his mother, or that Vlad Drukol was punctilious about saying his prayers every day. He tried to teach Warlock how to make rabble-rousing political speeches to sway the hearts and minds of multitudes. Mr. Cortez taught him about Florence Nightingale, except for the bits about syphilis, Abraham Lincoln, and the appreciation of art. He tried to teach him about free will, self-denial, and doing unto others as you would wish them to do to you. They both read the child extensively from the Book of Revelation. Despite their best effort, Warlock showed a regrettable tendency to be good at maths. Neither of his tutors was entirely satisfied with his progress. When Warlock was 10, he liked baseball. He liked plastic toys that transformed into other plastic toys indistinguishable from the first set of plastic toys, except to the trained eye. He liked his stamp collection. He liked banana-flavored bubblegum. He liked comics and cartoons and his BMX bike. Crowley was troubled. They were in the cafeteria of the British Museum, another refuge for all weary foot soldiers of the Cold War. At the table to their left, 2 ramrod-straight Americans in suits were surreptitiously handing over a briefcase full of deniable dollars to a small dark woman in sunglasses. At the table on their right, the deputy head of M17 and the local KGB station officer argued over who got to keep the receipt for the tea and buns. Crowley finally said what he had not even dared to think for the last decade. "If you ask me," Crowley said to his counterpart, "he's too bloody normal." Aziraphale popped another deviled egg into his mouth and washed it down with coffee. He dabbed his lips with a paper napkin. "It's my good influence," he beamed. "Or rather, credit where credit's due, that of my little team." Crowley shook his head. "I'm taking that into account. Look, by now he should be trying to warp the world around him to his own desires, shaping it into his own image, that kind of stuff. Well, not actually trying. He'll do it without even knowing it. Have you seen any evidence of that happening?" "Well, no, but by now he should be a powerhouse of raw force. Is he?" "Well, no, not as far as I've noticed, but he's too normal." Crowley drummed his fingers on the table. "I don't like it. There's something wrong. I just can't put my finger on it." Aziraphale helped himself to Crowley's slice of angel cake. "Well, he's a growing boy, and of course has been heavily influenced in his life." Crowley sighed. "I just hope he'll know how to cope with the Hellhound, that's all." Aziraphale raised one eyebrow. "Hellhound?" On his 11th birthday, I received a message from Hell last night." The message had come during the Golden Girls, one of Crowley's favorite television programs. Rose had taken 10 minutes to deliver what could have been quite a brief communication, and by the time non and feral service was restored, Crowley had quite lost the thread of the plot. "They're sending him a hellhound to pad by his side and guard him from all harm. Biggest one they've got." Won't people remark on the sudden appearance of a huge black dog's? His parents, for a start. Crowley stood up suddenly, treading on the foot of a Bulgarian cultural attaché who was talking animately to the keeper of Her Majesty's antiques. "Nobody's going to notice anything out of the ordinary. It's reality, Angel, and young Warlock can do what he wants with that, whether he knows it or not." "When does it turn up, then, this dog? Does it have a name?" "I told you, on his 11th birthday, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it'll sort of home in on him. He's supposed to name it himself. It's very important that he names it himself. It gives it purpose, to be killer or terror or stalks by night, I expect." "Are you going to be there?" asked Angel nonchalantly. "Wouldn't miss it for the worlds," said Crowley. "I do hope there's nothing too wrong with the child. We'll see how he reacts to the dog anyway. That should tell us something. I hope he'll send it back, or be frightened of it. But if he does name it, we've lost. He'll have all his powers, and Armageddon is just around the corner." "I think," said Aziraphale, sipping his wine, which had just ceased to be a slightly vinegary boulajus, and had become a quite acceptable but rather surprised Chateau Lafay 1875. "I think I'll see you there."